It was silent on Benji's command deck, despite the hypervelocity hurricane howling about the assault pod's hull as it blazed deeper and deeper into the atmospheric envelope, and Menenka felt her heart sink as she studied the available data. The planetary reconnaissance system had largely been destroyed, but a few of its satellites still survived, and now that the 39th Battalion had arrived, they had someone to report to once more. It was an advantage of which she knew Colonel Tukovsky meant to take full advantage, but very little of what they had reported so far was good. The Melkonian planetary assault had been led by 5 of their heavy assault brigades, each composed of 2 armored regiments of 30 mechs each, 12 Heimdall-class light reconnaissance mechs, and 6 of their fists, with a total of 6 Surturs and 12 Fenrises, plus 1 infantry regiment and an air cavalry regiment, supported by an artillery battalion. That was bad enough, but the initial assault wave had been followed up by 2 full infantry divisions and at least 12 strategic bombardment regiments, with their long-range missile batteries, and a number of matching space defense missile sites. They had also deployed at least 4 additional anti-armor regiments of Loki tank destroyers, each of them basically little more than a single 60-centimeter hellbore, mounted on an unarmored ground effect or counter-grav lift platform. They were fast and packed a punch, which could be dangerous, especially if they could get into a flanking position, but they were relatively easy to kill once they revealed their positions. That, unfortunately, wasn't something the battalion could count on them doing. The Melkonian advantage in stealth technology applied to their ground systems as well as their space-going platforms. Human sensors were better than the Melkonian equivalent, which tended to level the playing field somewhat, but Melkonian platforms like Loki's could be extremely difficult for even a bolo to spot, especially if they'd had a few hours in which to perfect their camouflage. Still, it appeared from the reconnaissance satellites that the puppies had opted for more of a brute force approach than sneakiness. Either that, or their campaign plan had accepted from the beginning that a Concordiat relief force was likely to arrive before they could set about the business of properly exterminating the planetary population. Whatever their reasoning, they had avoided dispersing their forces in smaller concentrations the 39th could have chopped up in detail. Instead, the vast majority of their ground units were concentrated in a single, roughly semicircular defensive perimeter near the southern end of Lorraine, the planet's single heavily populated continent. The ends of the perimeter's arc of fortified positions were firmly anchored on the ocean, which provided at least some protection to their backs, and while concentrating their forces that tightly might make them a tempting target, it also allowed them to concentrate all of their defensive firepower. What they had assembled there would have been sufficient to make a battlecruiser squadron think twice about closing in to engage them from space, and it was obvious that despite the relatively short time they'd been in possession of the planet, they dug their ground combats in deeply. Menenka's command couch jolted her suddenly as the assault pod hit the surface of Chartres. At least we got down unopposed, she told herself, and felt more quivers as Benji released the docking latches, threw power to his drivetrain, and ground free of the pod. The Bolo was monitoring Captain Bolostenik's communications channels, and she heard the Marines' clipped, tersely professional combat chatter as their own vehicles whined out of the pod's vehicle bays. Benji's starboard infinite repeaters fired suddenly, knocking down an air-breathing Melkonian recon drone as it popped up over a nearby line of hills. The drone disintegrated into a flaming, fragment-raining ball before it could possibly have gotten off a contact report, and Benji's secondary turret swung smoothly, rotating back and forth as he waited for additional targets. Captain Harris and Allen had brought their pod in less than 2 kilometers to the west of Benji's current position, and the remainder of Tannenberg's assault load was rapidly assembling around them. Tannenberg herself and all 7 of the other transports had never even approached the atmosphere, and they were already streaking directly away from the planet and the ferocious battle raging between Commodore Selkirk's outnumbered task force and the Romanian Melkonian warships in the system. Menenka knew the unarmed, agile transport vessels had no business anywhere near anyone who could shoot at them once their bolos had been landed. Drop and scoot had been the standard doctrine for the brigades supporting Transport Command for centuries, after all. But that didn't prevent a chill sense of abandonment as she watched their transportation racing to get far enough away from the planet to drop into hyper. Talk about burning your bridges behind you, she thought wryly, as Alan knocked down a second recon drone, and she surprised herself with a desert-dry chuckle of amusement.
All right, people.
Colonel Tukovsky's voice came over the battalion command net from Unit 28G740GRG.
We're down, we're in one piece, and we know where the dog boys are. And unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time. Commodore Selkirk is still wading into them, but it doesn't look good for his task force. So we have to break into the dog boy position before any of their starships get loose and turn up to start dropping missiles on our heads as we advance. That's going to limit our tactical options, and we have to assume the dog boys will manage to localize us and bring us under fire before we get into attack range. Greg is loading movement orders into your bolos now, and General Hardesty's Marines will conform to our movements.
Maneka watched the intricate patterns of lines and arrows representing the movement of the battalion, and the four Mark 27 reconnaissance bolos of the attached 351st Reconnaissance Company appeared on her secondary plot. The battalion had dropped well within the Malconians' theoretical engagement envelope, but the combined destruction of the warships, which had been giving them firepower support, and the loss of their orbital reconnaissance platforms had at least temporarily blinded the puppies. No one could hit what they couldn't see, so until the Malconians could positively locate the battalion, all of their firepower was useless, which of course explained the drones Benji and Alan had knocked down. Colonel Tukovsky's bolo, Greg, was feeding the battalion's movements plan simultaneously to the Marines Manenka knew and watched the blue icons of the 9th Division flowing into formation behind the battalion. Well behind the battalion. Their infantry carriers and supporting light whippet tanks, unlike those used by the Malconians, were all counter-grav supported, with a sprint speed of well over 500 kilometers per hour. They would lie back far enough to steer clear of the tornado of fire the battalion would expect to draw as it advanced toward the Malconian position. If the battalion succeeded in breaking that perimeter, the 9th would come in screaming in behind them, and Manenka had a very clear mental image of what the heavily armed Marine troopers in their individual powered combat armor would do to the puppies if they ever got to grips with their more lightly armored infantry adversaries. But unless the battalion could open up a breach for them, any attempt by the Marines to close with the enemy would be suicidal. So if the battalion failed, instead of racing to exploit success, the 9th troopers would use that same speed to fall back to the Chartres refugee centers, where they might at least hope to kill a few more Malconians before the puppies' combat mechs ground them into the mud.
All right, people.
Colonel Everard Tchaikovsky said as the final movement orders were acknowledged by all units.
Greg estimates 97 minutes to contact with the enemy. Let's go.
Green, rolling woodland spread out before Manenka in the panoramic view from Benji's forward optical head as the battalion thundered toward the enemy. At least some of the puppy's recon drones had lasted long enough to spot them now, and she felt her hands sweating, the dryness of her mouth, as the first Malconian long-range fire screamed toward them. She tried not to think about the odds. 60 Surturs and twice as many Fenrises would have been heavy odds for even a battalion of modern bolos. For the 39th, they were impossible, and for every human and bolo in the battalion from the colonel down, knew it. Malconian warships are entering range of the planet, Benji announced, and Manenka responded with a jerky nod. Commodore Selkirk's task force had paid the price of its gallantry. Not a single one of its ships had survived, but they'd ripped the guts out of the Malconian fleet before they had died. None of the puppies' battleships or battle cruisers remained, nor did any of their heavy cruisers, but 9 light cruisers and 11 destroyers had been screaming toward Chartres at maximum for over 12 minutes now. She'd hoped the battalion would win the race, to get to grips with the puppies' ground forces before the surviving fleet units could intervene. But the numbers blinked in on Benji's plot in grim confirmation that they would not. The missile batteries the Malconians had dug in at the heart of their ground enclave vomited fire, and high-trajectory missiles rained down on the battalion. More felt like cosmic flails, fired from the approaching warships to support the ground-based systems. Their flight profiles gave the battalion easy intercept solutions, but they'd never actually been intended to get through in the first place. Their function was solely to saturate the Bolos' defenses, while the real killers broke through at lower altitudes. Remote platforms report cruise missiles launching along all the enemy front, Benji's resonant baritone told her.
Current estimate, approximately 4,000 plus or minus 15%.
Understood,
Menenka rasped tautly. Colonel Tchaikovsky advises us that the enemy cruisers and destroyers are altering course. On the basis of their new heading and speed, I estimate a probability of 96.72% that they will endeavor to enter energy range of the battalion simultaneous with the arrival of the low-altitude missile attack.
You're just full of good news this afternoon, aren't you?
She responded, baring her teeth in what might have charitably been called a smile. I would not call it good, Benji replied with one of his electronic chuckles. On the other hand, the enemy's obvious desire to mass all available firepower at the earliest possible moment does offer us some tactical advantages, Menenka.
Yeah, sure it does.
She shook her head. I am serious, the Bolo told her, and she stopped shaking her head and looked up at the internal visual pickup in disbelief.
Just how does piling even more firepower on top of us improve our chances of survival?
She demanded. I did not say it would enhance our survival probability. I merely observed that it offers us certain tactical advantages, or openings at least, which we could not generate ourselves. The Bolo replied, and there was more than simple electronic certitude in his voice. There was experience, the personal experience of his 126 years' service against the enemies of mankind. If their warships had opted to remain at extended missile ranges, rather than bringing their energy batteries into play, they would have remained beyond the range of our energy weapons. As it is, however, analysis of their new flight paths indicates they will enter their own energy weapon range of the battalion 16.53 seconds before the arrival of the ground force cruise missiles. Menenka Trevor's blue eyes widened in understanding, and the Bolo produced another chuckle. This one was cold, without a trace of humor.
They're giving us a shot at them before their missiles reach us?
She asked. Indeed, they have clearly attempted to coordinate the maneuver carefully, but their timing appears to be inadequate to their needs. Unless they correct their flight profiles within the next 38 seconds, the battalion will be able to engage each warship at least once before their cruise missiles execute their terminal maneuvers. If they had been willing to wait till after the initial missile attack before closing, or even to remain permanently beyond Hellbore range, they would have eventually been able to destroy the entire battalion with missiles alone.
Instead of giving us the opportunity to take out their orbital fire support completely,
She finished for him. Indeed, Benji repeated, and she heard the approval and pride in his deep voice. Pride in her, she realized, in the student she had become when the colonel gave her her first Bolo command, and in so doing committed her into that Bolo's care for her true training. That was what put the pride into his voice, the fact that his student had grasped the enormity of the Melkonian's error so quickly. The plunging thunder of the incoming high-trajectory missiles howled down out of the heavens like lightning bolts of crazed deities. But the charging behemoths of the 39th Battalion didn't even slow. Ancient as they might be, they were Bolos. Batteries of ion bolt infinite repeaters and laser clusters raised their muzzle toward the skies and raved defiance. Counter-missile cells spat fire and the heavens blazed. The battalion raced forward at over 80 kilometers per hour through the thick virgin forest. Not even their stupendous bulk could remain steady over at such terrain at such a high a speed, and the shock frame of Menenka's command couch hammered at her as Benji shuddered and rolled like some ancient windjammer of old Earth rounding Cape Horn. But even as his mighty tracks ground the 60-meter tree trunks into crushed chlorophyll, his weapons tracked the incoming missiles with deadly precision. Missile after missile, dozens, scores of them simultaneously, disappeared in eye-tearing fireballs that dimmed the light of Chartreus's primary into insignificance. Despite her terror, despite the certainty that the battalion could not win, Menenka Trevor stared at the imagery on her visual display with a sense of awe. The Melkonian missile attack was a hemisphere of flame, a moving bowl above her where nothing existed but fire and destruction, and the glaring corona of wrath of an entire battalion of Bolos. Enemy cruise missiles entering our defensive envelope in 21.4 seconds, Benji announced calmly even as the display filled with blinding light. Enemy warships entering engagement range in 4.61 seconds, he added, and there was much hunger and satisfaction in his tone.
stand by to engage,
Menenka said, although both of them knew it was purely a formality. Standing by, Benji acknowledged, and his main turret trained around in a smooth whine of power, hellbore elevating. Menenka's eyes strayed from the visual display to the tactical plot, and her blood ran cold as she saw the incredibly dense rash of missile icons streaking toward her. The battalion's reconnaissance drones were high enough to look down at the terrain following missiles as they streaked through the atmosphere, barely 50 meters above the highest terrain obstacles at 5 times the speed of sound. The atmospheric shock waves of thousands of missiles generated at that velocity were like a giant hammer, smashing everything in their path around into splinters. And when they reached the battalion, it would be even worse. At their speeds, even the Bolos would have only tiny fractions of a second to engage them, and their defenses were already effectively saturated by the ongoing high-trajectory bombardment. Between the missile storm and the main body of the battalion was the 351st Recon's 4 Mark 27s. 20% lighter and more agile than the Mark 28, the Invictus Bolos were much more heavily equipped with stealth and ECM. And they had sacrificed the Mark 28's extensive VLS missile cells in favor of even more active anti-missile defenses. It was their job to fight for information, if necessary, and with their higher speed, to probe ahead of the battalion for traps and ambushes the enemy might have managed to conceal from the reconnaissance drones. But now the position meant that they would take the first brunt of the crew's missiles, unless their sophisticated electronic warfare systems could convince the puppy missile seekers they were somewhere else. She jerked her eyes away from those horribly exposed icons, and her teeth flashed in an ivory snarl as a score of other icons in another quarter of the display, the ones representing the Malconian destroyers and light cruisers, were snared in sudden crimson sighting circles. Enemy warships acquired, Benji announced, and then instantly, engaging. A dozen 110-centimeter hellbores fired as one, and the atmosphere, already tortured by the explosions of dying missiles, shrieked in protest as massive thunderbolts of plasma howled upward. All 9 Malconian light cruisers and 3 of the destroyers died instantly, vomiting flame as those incredible bolts of energy ripped contemptuously through their battle screens and splintered their hulls. Superconductor capacitors ruptured and antimatter containment fields failed, adding their own massive energy to the destruction, and the vacuum above Chartres rippled and burned. The horrified crews of the remaining Malconian destroyers had exactly 4 fleeting seconds to realize what had happened. That was the cycle time of the Mark 28's Hellbore. And precisely 4 seconds later, a fresh, equally violent blast of light and fury marked the deaths of the remaining enemy warships. Menenka Trevor heard her own soprano banshee howl of triumph, but even as the battalion turret swiveled back around, the tidal bore of cruise missiles burst in upon it. Counter missiles, infinite repeaters, laser clusters, autocannon, even anti-personnel clusters belched defiance as the hypervelocity projectiles came streaking in. They died by the dozens, by the score, by the 100, but they came in by thousands, and not even Bolo's active defenses could intercept them all. Battle screens stopped some of them missed, some of them killed one another, consuming each other in their fireball deaths, but far too many got through. The exposed Mark 27 suffered first. Menenka's shock frame hammered her savagely as Benji's massive hull twisted through an intricate evasion pattern, his defensive weapons streaming fire. But even through scores of missiles bored in on him, far more, probably as many as half or even 2/3 of the total Malconian launch, had locked onto the quartet of Mark 27s. The Invictus might mount more anti-missile defenses than the Triumphant, but not enough to weather this storm. For an instant, she wondered what had gone wrong with their EW systems, why so many missiles had been able to lock onto them. And then she realized they weren't trying to prevent the missiles from locking them up. They were deliberately enhancing their target signatures, turning themselves into decoys, drawing the missiles in away from the battalion. Her heart froze as she recognized what they were doing. And then the Holocaust washed over them. The towering explosions crashed down on the reconnaissance company like the boot of some angry titan, hobnailed in nuclear flame. They were 40 kilometers ahead of the battalion's main body, and the warheads were standard puppy issue, incongruously clean in what had become a genocidal war of mutual extermination. Yet there were hundreds of them, and the lethal tides of radiation sleeted outward with a thermal flash, followed moments later by the blast front itself. Menenka clung to her sanity with bleeding fingernails as Thor's hammer slammed into Benji. The huge bolo lurched like a storm-tossed galleon as the green living forest about them, already torn and outraged by the battalion's passage, and the handful of high-trajectory missiles which it had gotten through flashed into instant flame. The battalion charged onward, straight through that incandescent inferno, dura-alloy armor shrugging aside the radiation and blast and heat which would have smashed the life instantly from the fragile protoplasmic beings riding their command decks. The visual display showed only a writhing ocean of fire and dust, of explosion and howling wind, like some obscene preview of hell. But it was hell Bolos were engineered to survive and defeat. None of the reconnaissance Bolos in the direct path of the missile strike survived, but the chaos and massive spikes of EMP generated by the missiles which killed them had disastrous effects on the missiles which had acquired the rest of the battalion. Those same conditions hampered the Bolos' anti-missile defenses, but the degradation it imposed on the missiles' kill probabilities was decisive. Not that there weren't still plenty of them to go around. Over 70 targeted Benji, even as he charged through the raging fires and devastation of the primary strike zone. The gargantuan Bolos' point defenses stopped most of them short of his battle screen, but 23 reached attack range, and his 15,000-ton hull bucked and heaved as the fusion warheads gouged at his battle screen and drove searing spikes of hellfire directly into his armor. Thor's hammer smashed down again, then again, and again, and again. Even through the concussions and terrifying vibration, Menenka could see entire swaths of his battle board blazing bloody scarlet as damage ripped away weapons and sensors. But then, suddenly to be real, the hammer blows stopped. 10 of the 16 Bolos who had been targeted charged out of the far side of that holocaust, leaving behind all 4 of the 351st Mark 27s. 2 of the battalion's Mark 28s had also been destroyed, and all of the survivors were damaged to greater or lesser extent, but they had destroyed the entire remaining Melkonian support squadron, and the enemy LZ was just ahead. I have sustained moderate damage to my secondary batteries and forward sensors. Main battery and indirect fire systems operational at 87.65% of base capability. Track 3 has been immobilized, but I am still capable of 92.56% normal road speed. Estimate 9.33 minutes to contact with enemy direct fire perimeter weapons at current rate of advance. Request missile release. Missile release ought to have been authorized by Colonel Tukovsky, Menenka thought, but Tukovsky's Greg was one of the Bolos they'd lost, and Major Frederick's Peggy had suffered major damage to her communication arrays. There was no time to consult anyone else, and independent decisions were one of the things Bolo commanders were trained to make.
Release granted. Open fire,
She snapped. Acknowledged, Benji replied, and the heavily armored hatches of his VLS tube sprang open. His own missiles blasted outward, then streaked away in ground-hugging supersonic flight. They were shorter ranged and marginally slower than the ones Melkonians had hurled at the battalion, but they were also far more agile, and the relatively short launch range and low cruising altitudes gave the defenders less capable reconnaissance drones even less tracking time than the battalion had been given against the Melkonian missiles. Fireballs raged along the Melkonian perimeter, blasting away outer emplacements and dug-in armored units. Weapons and sensor posts, Loki-class tank destroyers, and air defense batteries vanished into the maw of the 39th Battalion's fury. Benji's 30-centimeter rapid-fire mortars joined the attack, vomiting terminally guided projectiles into the vortex of destruction. Follow-on flights of Melkonian missiles shrieked to meet them from the missile batteries to the rear, but the indirect fire weapons had lost virtually all of their observation capability. Their targeting solutions were much more tentative, and the chaos and the explosions hampered the missiles' onboard seeker systems, and the gaping hole ripping deeper and deeper into their perimeter was costing them both launchers and the sensor capability, which might have been able to sort out the maelstrom of devastation well enough to improve their accuracy. But hidden among the merely mortal Melkonian emplacements were their own war machines. The Heimdalls were too light to threaten a Bolo. Even the Ninth manned vehicles were more than a match for them. But the fists of Surturs and Fenrises were something else entirely. Heavier, tougher, and more dangerous. They outnumbered the battalion survivors by 18 to 1, and they had the advantage of prepared positions. Another of the battalion's Bolos lurched to a halt, vomiting intolerable heat and light as a plasma bolt punched through his thinner side armor. Benji fired on the move, main turret tracking smoothly, and his entire hull heaved as a main battery shot belched from his hellbore and disemboweled the Surtur, which had just killed his brigade brother. Another Surtur died, and Benji's far less powerful infinite repeater shot ion bolt after lethal ion bolt, shrieking across the vanishing gap between the battalion and the Melkonian perimeter to rend and destroy the Surtur's lighter, weaker companions. "Take point, Benji," Menenka barked as yet another Bolo slewed to a halt. Streaming smoke and flame, her eyes dropped to the sidebar, and she felt a stab of grief as the unblinking letter codes identified the victim as lazy. It looked like a mission kill, not complete destruction, she thought, but the damage could have punched deeply into the lazy's personality center, and there was no way Lieutenant Takahashi could have survived. And there was no time to mourn them either. Benji surged forward, the apex of a wedge of 8 bleeding titans. Surturs reared up at a deeply dug-in hides, lurching around to counterattack from the flanks and rear as the battalion smashed through the outer perimeter, hellbores howling in point-blank continuous fire. We're into the rear, the corner of Menenka's brain realized, with a sense of triumph that stabbed even through the horror and the terror. A brilliant purple icon blazed abruptly on Benji's tactical plot, as his analysis of the Melkonian comm signal suddenly revealed what had to be a major communications node.
The CP. Benji, take the CP.
Menenka snapped. Acknowledged, Benji replied without hesitation, and he altered his course once more, smashing his way toward the command post. It loomed before him, and as Menenka watched the attack analysis spilling up the plot's sidebars, she realized what it truly was. Not a command post, but the command post. The central nerve plexus of the entire puppy position. They had found the organizing brain of the Melkonian enclave, and she felt sudden flares of hope. They could reach that command post, take it out, cripple the enemy's command and control function long enough for the Ninth to break through the hole they'd torn, then maybe. A pair of Surturs, flanked by their attendant mediums, loomed suddenly out of the chaos, hellbores throwing sheets of plasma at the Bolos, rampaging through their lines. Benji blew the left flank Surtur into incandescent white ruin, while Peggy shouldered up on his right and killed the other. Their infinite repeaters raved as the Fenrises split, trying to circle wide and get at their weaker flank defenses. And the medium Melkonian mechs slithered to a halt, spewing fury and hard radiation as their antimatter plants blew. Then a trio of Fenris-class mediums, all of them orphans which had lost their Surturs, appeared out of nowhere. Their lighter weapons bellowed, and they were on the left flank of Captain Harrison Allen. They fired once, twice, and then there were only 7 Bolos left. Benji's port infinite repeater battery shredded Allen's killers, even as 2 more Surturs reared up suddenly before him. One of them fired past him, slamming 3 hellbore bolts simultaneously into Peggy. The Bolo's battle screen attenuated the bolts, and the anti-plasma armor applique absorbed and deflected much of their power, but the range was too short and the weapons too powerful. One of the newer Bolos, with the improved armor alloys and better internal destructor shielding, might have survived. Peggy and Major Angela Fredericks did not. Benji's turret spun with snake-like speed, and his hellbore sent a far more powerful bolt straight through the frontal glacis plate of the second Surtur before it could fire, then swiveled desperately back toward the first Melkonian mech. 6, Menenka had an instant to think. There are only 6 of us now. And then, in the same fragmented second, both war machines fired. Hull breach! Benji's voice barked. Hull breach in! There was an instant fleeting stutter in the pulse of eternity that would forever live in Menenka Trevor's nightmares, when her senses recorded everything with intolerable clarity. The terrible, searing flash of light, the simultaneous blast of agony, the flashing blur of movement, as Unit 28G862BNJ slammed the inner Dura alloy carapace across his commander's couch. She blinked her remaining eye in syrupy slow motion, her sluggish brain trying to grapple with her wounds. And then a hand touched her left shoulder. She turned back in that direction, eyes squinting, trying to make out the details, and she saw a man in the battle dress uniform of the Concordiat Marine Corps. A colonel, she thought, then blinked. No, she was wrong again. He wore a colonel's uniform, but the insignia pinned to his collar was that of a brigadier.
Are you sure she's gonna be alright? She heard the colonel turned brigadier say.
He was looking at someone else, a man in white. We got to her in time, the man in white said reassuringly. Actually, your people got to her in time and pulled her out while she still had something to work with. It's going to take time and a lot of regen to put her back on her feet, but the actual repairs be fairly routine. Extensive, but routine.
You have a different definition of routine from me, Doctor,
the Marine officer said dryly, and then looked back down at Manenka.
Are you with us now, Lieutenant?
He asked, and she recognized the booming thunder from which disturbed her darkness in the quiet question. She looked up at him and tried to speak. Only a croak came out, and she licked dry, cracked lips with a tongue made of leftover leather. A hand reached down, holding a glass with a straw, and Manenka shuddered in raw, sensual pleasure as the unbelievable relief of ice water flowed down her throat.
Better?
The Marine asked, and she nodded.
Yes, sir,
she got out in a rusty croak. She stopped and cleared her throat hard enough to make her floating head feel real, and then she tried again.
Thank you.
At least this time, it sounded a little like her, she thought. Her brain was beginning to function once more, although her thoughts remained far from clear. She found herself wondering how she could have possibly not feel the pain of her wounds, then gave a distant sort of mental snort. No doubt they had an entire battalion of pain suppressors focused on her, which probably helped explain the haziness of her mental processes, now that she thought about it. As if he had read her thoughts, the man in white reached out, twiddling his fingers on a virtual keyboard, and the woolly blanket slipped back from the front of her brain. A faint wash of pain, and an echo of something she sensed was vast and terrible, but which was not allowed to touch her, came with the clarity, and she was swallowed again, then gave him a tiny nod of thanks. No more than that, Lieutenant, the doctor said gruffly. You look like someone who's wanting her mind working, but you'll have to settle for where you are at the moment.
Yes, sir.
Her voice was still rusty and broken sounding in her own ears, but her speech was less slurred, and she felt more in control of her brain cells, rousing them to action.
I'm Colonel, Brigadier Shalleck, Lieutenant Trevor, the Marine said,
and she returned her working eye to him.
I apologize for disturbing you, but they're going to be shipping you off-world this afternoon, and I wanted to speak with you personally before they do.
Off-world? Manenka repeated. Sir,
she added hastily, and he gave her a smile. It was a very small smile, shadowed with things that were far from humorous, but it was real.
Just for this minute, Lieutenant, don't worry about the military courtesy, he suggested gently.
She nodded on her pillow, but in her clearer brain was beginning to function properly. She realized that, impossible as it may seem, they must have won. It was the only way anyone could be talking about sending her off-world, and it was the only way she could still be alive.
The reason I wanted to talk to you, Lieutenant, was to thank you,
the Marine officer continued after a moment. She looked at him, and he twitched one hand, palm uppermost between them.
That thanks comes from me personally, from the 9th Marines, what's left of us, and from every living human on Chartres, because without you and your battalion, none of us would be alive today.
The battalion, Manenka began,
and Shalleck squeezed her good shoulder again.
You broke them, Lieutenant, he said simply. I doubt anyone would have believed it if they hadn't seen it, but you broke them. You tore a hole 10 kilometers wide right through the middle of their line. You took out every searcher they had, and then you smashed their central command post. Apparently, they hadn't had time to yet put up a backup CP, and when you took it out, their command and control went straight to hell, as did they, over space of the next few hours. He smiled again, and this time his smile was harsh and ugly. It didn't come cheap, he went on after a moment. Not for any of us. I'm the senior ranking officer the Ninth has left, and the entire division isn't really more than an understrength brigade. But there isn't a breathing dog boy left on Chartres. On your way in, the 39th also took out what appears to be their entire surviving fleet strength in system after Commodore Selkirk got done with them. And Admiral Kwang's relief task force got to us 2 days ago. We've lost almost 700 million people on Chartres, Lieutenant, but almost 2 billion others are alive because of you. All because of us, I suppose, but we couldn't have done any of it without the 39th.
Manenka looked at him. A cold, icy fist squeezed her heart. He hadn't said a word about the battalion's casualties, and he would have, unless he knew how much it was going to hurt when he did. She closed her eye for just a moment, wishing with all her heart that she was still unconscious, but she wasn't, and because she wasn't, she had no choice.
And the battalion, sir?
She heard her voice ask levelly, almost as if it belonged to someone else entirely.
And the battalion paid the price, Lieutenant, Shalleck said,
meeting her single cobalt blue eye unflinchingly. It wasn't easy for him, she could see that, but he owed her honesty, and he paid her the coin of candor. Then he drew a deep breath.
You're the only surviving Bolo commander,
he said with terrible gentleness. She stared at him in disbelief. No, a small, stern, deep voice within her said, with ruthless clarity, not disbelief, denial. But even as she thought that, she felt a wild, sudden surge of hope. Shalleck had called her the only surviving Bolo commander, and that meant,
Benji. Sir, Benji, my Bolo. How badly is he damaged?
Shalleck looked at her, still meeting her gaze, and then after a moment shook his head.
He didn't make it, Lieutenant,
he said softly. His gentle compassion was a dagger of fiery ice buried in her still beating heart. He was wrong. He had to be wrong. She was alive. That meant Benji had to have survived too, or she would have died in his destruction. She should have died in his destruction.
Bolo techs tell me one of your Bolos may survive, Shalleck went on, with that same gentle voice. Unit 179er Lima Alpha Zebra. I understand his survival center is still intact, and the hit that took out his command deck and main personality center did surprisingly little additional damage, but every other unit of the 39th Battalion was destroyed in action.
But how?
Her left hand moved weakly, gesturing around her at the hospital room and the medical equipment surrounding her bed, and Shalleck shook his head.
He got your survival capsule closed and pumped his entire command deck full of fire suppressant,
Shalleck said.
The capsule's emergency automatic kept you alive, and the suppressant had time to set its matrix before...
He broke off, and Manenka's eyes squeezed shut in understanding. The fire-suppressing foam used in the Bolo's damage control systems was less effective as it was actually suppressing fires than other technologies might have been, but it was retained because within 20 seconds of deployment, it set up into an artificial alloy almost as tough as the flint steel Bolo warhulls had been once made of, yet for all its toughness, it dissolved almost instantly under the touch of the proper nanotech solvent. Benji had used it to save her life. As he waded into that horrendous sea of fire, he had encased her in a dura-alloy capsule inside was effectively a block of solid armor over 3 meters across. Oh, Benji, she thought miserably, her broken heart twisting within her. Oh, Benji, how could you have done this to me?
How did...
She broke off and clutched the fingers of her remaining hand in an ivory-knuckled fist.
How did it happen?
She got out on the second attempt. Aye, the Marine started, then paused and looked at the doctor. I advised against it, the doctor said. She's in bad enough shape as it is, but... It was his turn to break off and look down at Manenka. His mouth tightened. But I've seen this before, he went on, his voice harsh, almost angry. Not at her. Manenka realized, even though the crushing iron fist of her grief, but it was something else. They picked them so young, the white-clad man went on. They train them. They give them war gods for friends. And when those war gods die, something... He closed his mouth, jaw muscles clenching, then shook himself. Go ahead, Brigadier. Not knowing will only make her tear herself up inside even worse. Shellick gazed at the doctor for several seconds, then nodded and looked back down at Manenka.
We got some of our own recon drones. The Knights, I mean. In with you when your battalion broke the line, Lieutenant.
He said, reaching into the left cargo pocket of his uniform and withdrew a small portable holo unit and laid it on the bedside table.
This is a recording of the imagery of one of those drones, Lieutenant Trevor. Are you certain you want to see it?
Manenka stared up, wanting to scream at him for the stupidity of his compassionate question. There was nothing in the universe she wanted less than to view that imagery, and nothing that could possibly have stopped her. She wanted to find some way to express that, but words were a clumsy, meaningless interface, so she simply nodded. Shellick's nostrils flared, then he pressed the play button. The holo came up instantly, crystal clear, its shapes a light sculpture solid enough to touch, and Manenka felt herself falling into its depths. She saw 6 brutally damaged bolos hammering forward, led by one whose hull bore the remnants of the unit code 862BNJ in half-obliterated letters down one of its scored and seared flanks. From the drone's perspective, she could see the glowing wound of the Surtur hellboard blasted through Benji's armor, the one that had come so close to killing both of them. She could actually see a gray-white scab spilling out of the hole, and some fragment of her brain recognized it as the overflow of the fire suppressant, with which he must have packed into the entire web of his internal access spaces. Explosions and energy weapons ripped and tore at them. Missiles screamed in and disintegrated under the pounding and point defense clusters and autocannon, or exploded in savage fury against battle screens that glowed with incandescent fury, and the fury of energies they fought to somehow turn aside. Light and medium Melkonian combat mechs charged in to meet them, like packs of jackals, charging wounded grizzlies. Infinite repeaters tore the jackals apart, grinding tracks smashed over their blazing corpses, grinding them into the mud, but still they came, and there were scores of them. A handful of Surturs reared among them, towering over them like titans, and the thunderbolt slammed back and forth as main battery fire added itself to the seething holocaust. 2 of the bolos lurched to a halt, belching smoke and incandescent fury as multiple hellbores blasted through their armor. Surturs exploded as the 4 survivors smashed back, but 2 more of the Melkonian war machines loomed suddenly on the bolos' flank. The exchange of fire lasted less than 10 seconds. When it was done, every Surtur was dead, and only Benji remained, still charging forward, all alone now, into the teeth of desperate Melkonian fire. Manenka blinked her remaining eye hard. The film of tears defied her efforts, and she scrubbed at them furiously with her left hand, uselessly. Her vision was still blurred and ran, yet she saw every hideous detail as Benji advanced single-handedly into the very maw of hell. I should have been with him, she thought, and knew it was insane, even as it hammered into her brain. She had been with him. Her own body was inside that staggering, smoking wreck of a bolo as it clawed its way onward. But it wasn't the same thing. She hadn't been with him, hadn't been there for him on his march to Golgotha. He had been alone, abandoned, left without the presence of even a single friend. And yet he never flinched, never hesitated. His entire starboard suspension system had been destroyed, but he blew the tracks and advanced on the bare bogies. A Loki-class tank destroyer popped up out of its hide behind him and lasted long enough to fire before a trio of ion bolts tore it apart. Its screaming plasma bolts smashed through the thinner armor at the rear of Benji's main turret, and the turret shattered, vomiting heat and shattered dura-alloy as it was consumed from within. Manenka's hand no longer scrubbed at her eye. It was pressed to her mouth, covering her trembling lips as she watched Benji still advancing. She knew about Bolo's psychotronic pain sensors. She knew about the agony which had to be shrieking through him, but his surviving weapons remained in action. His infinite repeaters went into continuous maximum fire, a ruinous rate which must burn them out in a handful of minutes unless they exploded first, and the lash of their ion bolts blasted a molten path through the enemies still swarming down upon him. They were like locusts, sensing the weakness of his defenses, flinging themselves against him, frantic to stop him before he reached the critical command node, which was the heart and brain of their own defense, the massively defended command post which she had ordered him to attack. Air cavalry mounts raced in, firing rockets and cannon that must have ripped through his wavering battle screen. Light manned hellbores lacerated his flanks, gouged half-molten chasms through his armor. Missiles and artillery's fire exploded around him, and still he advanced. And then somehow, impossibly, the staggering wreck, which had been her friend, reached his final objective. His hellbore was gone, and his infinite repeaters were too light to penetrate the ceramicrete facing the hastily constructed command post. But he still had one weapon. He ground slowly, agonizingly forward, until his 15,000-ton hull crunched over the bunker, smashing and crushing. He lurched to a halt, then, unable or unwilling to move further, and his surviving infinite repeaters continued to blaze as the Melkonians closed in on him from all sides with a fury that would not be denied. He had accomplished his mission. Sanity would have told the Melkonians there was no point in continuing to waste combat power against him when they might soon need it to desperately against other foes. But he'd cost them too much, hurt them too badly for them to realize that, and so they swarmed towards him, wasting their strength, and Menenka realized, knew, as if she had heard his baritone voice once again, that that was the reason he had stopped where he was, why he wasn't even attempting maneuver. Like the Invictuses of the 351st, he was deliberately drawing the remaining combat strength down upon himself and away from the Marines advancing in the battalion's wake. It could not last long. That was the only mercy Menenka could think of, yet even as she did, she knew how eternal those brief screaming minutes of agony and destruction must have been to a person who thought at psychotronic speed. They came from all directions. Lokis, a handful of Fenrises, Heimdall reconnaissance mechs, air cavalry mounts, even Melkonian infantrymen. Every one of them poured fire into Benji's dying hull. One by one, his remaining weapons were silenced, blown into ruin, while breaches were hammered deeper and deeper into him. Menenka knew she was sobbing aloud, and she couldn't stop. She didn't want to stop. As his hull glowed brighter and brighter and hotter, with the transfer of energy bleeding into it. And still he fought, with all the incredible toughness of all Bolo kind and the courage of a century-old psychotronic heart. Yet any toughness, any courage must eventually fall under that onslaught, and the Melkonian pack swept over him at last. A Loki, one of the last half dozen or less the Melkonians still had maneuvered into the kill position. Benji's last surviving secondary turret was still firing, still killing targets with flashing precision, when the plasma lance ripped into his survival center at last. Menenka could never remember the exact words Sheliak had said after that. They were only sounds, only noise. She knew he was telling her the 9th Marines had only been able to break through because of Benji, that his final stand had drawn the Melkonian reserves, concentrated the majority of the Melkonian mobile strength into one spot, where the Marines' light armored units had taken it from behind, that Benji's death had saved almost 2 billion human lives. She knew all of that, understood all of that, and yet the words remained deeply only sounds, only echoes of something which had no significance against the loss and anguish twisting deep into her soul. They left her then, after a time, and Sheliak took the hollow player with him. Perhaps she thought he wanted to prevent her from replaying the record, witnessing Benji's death again and again. But if he did, it was a wasted effort. She needed no hollow player, would never need one. The images were part of her now, burned into her, and she closed her eye as they washed over her once more. With your shield or on it, carrying it in triumph or carried upon it in death. That was the ancient admonition Benji had once quoted to her on the day he explained the unspoken and unwritten compact between Bolos and their human commanders, to face death together, to share it when the time came for them both. But Menenka had come back neither with her shield nor on it. She hadn't met her part of the compact. She knew it was irrational, insane, to blame herself for that. And she knew, as if Benji were parked beside her in bed telling her, that she would just have given anything for his survival. He had just wanted her to survive. And because he had, she would. However much it hurt, she would. She rolled her head on the pillow, blotting her tears, and touched the grief she knew would never leave her again. "Oh, Benji," she whispered from the silence of her mind. "Oh, Benji."